to say good evening. Maybe I will say thank you for joining us on this rather inauspicious day for what I hope will be some maybe collective talk therapy. You can think about it that way. I'm Aaron Glass, professor of cultural anthropology and associate chair of research programs here at Bard Graduate Center. On behalf of our director, Susan Weber, I'm thrilled to welcome you all here to this year's second installment of our lecture series dedicated to celebrating new publications by members of our faculty. Here at BGC, we study cultural histories through their material traces and the complex ways in which decorative arts, design, and material culture mediate our own relationships with the past in the present. We do this work cognizant of our own location in time and space, in this heart of Lenapehoking, the ancestral territories of the Lenni Lenape people, and a past, present, and future home for indigenous peoples from around the world. We are also one block away from the former site of Seneca Village, a community of African American and immigrant property owners that was forcibly relocated to create Central Park. Tonight, in the wake of yet another historic and divisive election, we are all no doubt reflecting on America's own past, present, and precarious future. My invocation of multiple disciplines, cultures, temporalities, and perspectives nicely frames the intellectual eclecticism of our speaker tonight, my distinguished colleague Ivan Gaskell. Trained in both history and the history of art at Oxford, Cambridge, and London University, Ivan began his academic and curatorial career at the Warburg Institute in London, and then spent 20 years at Harvard as a lecturer and curator at the Fogg Art Museum, where he developed a penchant for experimental curation. When he arrived at BGC in 2012, he was invited to determine his own field title, as all of us can at our transdisciplinary institution, and he chose cultural history, first appended with museum studies, and now, he told me just the other day, with philosophy. To underline the breadth of his research, scholarship, teaching, and curation, on our website, he currently lists the following areas of special interest: material culture of North America, Oceania, and Europe from the 16th through the 20th centuries, global cultural encounter, and philosophy of museums and material culture in the realms of epistemology, ethics, and aesthetics. It's a shame he's so narrowly focused, don't you think? In fact, he put this capacious purview to work as the longtime head of focus projects, helping to steward diverse faculty or fellow curated exhibitions developed in seminars with our graduate students. I've had the pleasure of serving with him on multiple qualifying exam, master's, and doctoral committees, and always appreciate the intellectual rigor that he demands of students, colleagues, visiting lecturers, and of course, himself. And woe betide the interlocutor who uses the terms meaning, agency, or ontology imprecisely. I can't begin to do justice to the 30 pages of publications, accomplishments, and affiliations listed on his CV, so let me just say that Ivan has been a visiting fellow and sits on advisory boards at numerous international museums, universities, and art fairs, serves on the editorial boards of multiple distinguished journals, is a fixture on the global invited lecture and conference circuit, and is a frequent contributor of book and exhibit reviews. All of which is to say that his primary business is the free and wide exchange of ideas. Ivan is the author, co-author, or editor of 16 books, and we're in for a treat tonight as he presents material from his most recent publication, Mindprints, Thoreau's Material Worlds, which he has a copy of in his hands. And you have flyers for with QR codes on how to acquire them yourselves. Please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Ivan Gaskell.
Thanks so much. As Aaron so kindly indicates, I'm all over the place. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking as a guest in Lenapehoking, the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people, and that regardless of title deeds, this remains native land. It's a great pleasure to be able to present some of my ideas to you this evening. And I'd like to thank all my BGC colleagues who together create such a supportive environment in which to think, teach, and write. I also want to thank the students here who explored Thoreau with me. The philosophy editor at University of Chicago Press, Kyle Wagner, and his team have been wonderful. It's the best press I've ever worked with. Most of all, though, I want to thank my wife and partner, Jane Whitehead, who is my best interlocutor and editor and my fellow saunterer around Walden Pond. Who is here? Aaron asked me to say why I've written about Thoreau. There are two reasons. Whenever I face a particularly tough philosophical question, I have two go-to guys whose work almost invariably helps me to see a way through: Ludwig Wittgenstein and Henry David Thoreau. Second, writing this book was pure displacement activity. I ought to have been writing a book on the philosophy of museum values, but I couldn't face it any longer, so I turned to Thoreau. Now that the book is done, I'm back with those pesky museum values. And that's really all there is to it. Now, Thoreau is doubtless familiar to many of you, at the very least from having had to read Walden at high school. But just in case he's an unknown quantity, I begin with a brief outline of his life. He was born in 1817 in Concord, Massachusetts. He attended Harvard College, graduating in 1837. Thereafter, he led a somewhat improvised life, at times teaching, land surveying, and improving processes in his father's pencil works. He was close to his family, his parents, his two sisters, and most especially his elder brother John. John Thoreau's death from tetanus at the age of 26 in 1842 affected Thoreau profoundly. Encouraged by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was his mentor and lifelong interlocutor, thinking and writing were at the core of Thoreau's activities. Natural history and the human condition were his major concerns, notably human relationships with the natural world. Thoreau developed a commitment to the observation of the phenomenal world in all its variety and complexity. As literary scholar F.O. Matheson observed, Thoreau, quote, had a more dogged respect for the thing than any of his companions. He published a week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers in 1849, Walden or Life in the Woods in 1854, and several magazine articles. His sister, Sophia, assembled many of his writings for publication after his death, and from the later 19th century onward, scholars have prepared editions of his works. Thoreau's constantly reworked journals, kept between 1837 and 1861, constitute one of the richest documents of observation and reflection in American letters. Thoreau died of tuberculosis at the age of 44 in 1862. Thoreau was much concerned with material traces. To denote the material traces of those whom he termed the oldest men, he coined the word mindprint. This new word first appears in his journal in March 1859. There are many such traces. As he puts it in that journal entry, a trace, quote, is no single inscription on a particular rock, but a footprint, rather a mindprint, left everywhere. He specifies the products of Native Americans and ancient Assyrians, but by extension the term applies to all sensually apprehensible items with which humans interact. My principal question in my new book is, how do mindprints constitute worlds amenable to philosophical and historical examination? Now, I specify worlds in the plural, sensitive to the implication of Thoreau's question in Walden, why do precisely these objects which we behold make a world? Thoreau was precise in his language, so I take his use of the indefinite rather than the definite article before world, a world, to be deliberate. This, I think, has far-reaching implications. Soon after moving into the one-room house he built for himself in 1845 at Walden Pond, he asks in his journal, "Who knows who his neighbours are? We seem to lead our human lives amid a concentric system of worlds, of realm on realm, close bordering each other, where dwell the unknown and the imagined races, as various in degree as our own thoughts are, a system of invisible partitions more infinite in number and more inconceivable in intricacy than the starry one which science has penetrated." By imagined races, Thoreau means not solely humans, but all living things that he subsequently describes in the Brute Neighbours chapter of Walden. There he asks, "Why do precisely these objects which we behold make a world? Why has man just these species of animals for his neighbours, as if nothing but a mouse could have filled this crevice?" Each creature, even each mind print, contributes to the constitution of a world that is itself part of a concentric system. This thought contains the germ of what would later become ecology, yet it goes far beyond to contain phenomenal worlds of every kind, initially as encompassed by a transcendental concept of symbolism, exemplified in Emerson's thinking, but later developed into a conception of phenomena wholly Thoreau's own. Emerson insisted on the existence of one design, encompassing, animating, and uniting the phenomenal world. In contrast, Thoreau preserves multiplicity when considering how material items constitute worlds. By what means and in what registers does Thoreau explore worlds through Mindprints? The register on which I want to focus is best captured in the philosophical term aesthetics. I use aesthetics to bind with a single thread all the themes I address in my new book. This is not an aesthetics of beauty and sublimity alone, but one that concerns the properties of material items subject to judgment more broadly. I identify Thoreau's aesthetics as operating not within terms familiar in the discussion of the arts, which Thoreau regarded at best equivocally, but within those of everyday aesthetics, as defined by Yuriko Saito and Tom Leddy, and environmental aesthetics, as discussed by Ronald Hepburn, Alan Carlson, and Arnold Berliant. Thoreau's aesthetics largely operates, broadly speaking, within these philosophically defined realms. As for means, his principal one is direct observation and description of individual phenomena and instances, anchored by his systematic collection of material items. These collections comprised botanical and mineralogical specimens, birds' eggs, nests, and skins, and ancient North American indigenous artifacts. His collections aided him in trying to answer big questions about the worlds he apprehended. Those collections were, in part, aesthetically constituted. Thoreau brought his keen visual acuity to bear on their formation and examination. He arranged for most of them to go to a museum after his death. But this evening I want to draw your attention not to collected items that appeal to the sense of sight, but rather on phenomena of sound, subject to hearing. It's a truism that European thinking, going back to antiquity, lends privilege to sight among the senses as defined by Aristotle, and although not discounting them, relatively undervalues the other senses as sources of empirical knowledge claims. Cultural systems beyond Europe and its diaspora pay greater attention than do Europeans to the evidence of senses other than sight. I've been especially motivated to explore Thoreau's sensitivity to sound by the emphasis on hearing in indigenous American thinking. Thoreau's carefully recorded encounters with Native Americans likely reinforced any predisposition he may have had to take sound and hearing seriously as evidence for knowledge claims about the worlds he pondered. For a questing person, listening entails being orally sensitive to a wide range of phenomena, to other humans and to oneself. to birds, animals, and plants, to ancestors and spirits, and to the earth herself. Just 3 days after moving into his Walden Pond house, Thoreau noted in his journal, quote, sound was made not so much for convenience that we might hear when called, as to regale the sense and fill one of the avenues of life. He incorporated sounds on equal terms with sights and smells when discussing the big questions he asked. In an April 1852 journal entry, he asks, why should just these sights and sounds accompany our life? Why should I hear the chattering of blackbirds? Why smell the skunk each year? I would fain explore the mysterious relation between myself and these things. These were among the questions he addressed while writing Walden. Thoreau proposes an understanding of sensory apprehension akin to ideas familiar now through entanglement and material engagement theory. Thus, in an 1857 journal entry, he writes, if I were to discover that a certain kind of stone by the pond shore was affected, say, partially disintegrated by a particular natural sound, as of a bird or insect, I see that one could not be completely described without describing the other. Acknowledging a human role in such a reciprocal relationship, he continues immediately, I am that rock by the pond side. I'm not suggesting an anachronistic understanding of Thoreau's notions of sensory reciprocity and a fit between a bird and the ear that appreciates its melody, as he writes in his journal, as what he termed a natural fact. Rather, I propose that in formulating some of his numerous reflections on sound and hearing and their roles in constituting material worlds, Thoreau had learned a great deal from Native Americans. In late November 1850, a group of Penawepskoi, that's Penobscot, I tend to use the names that native communities use for themselves, who were visiting from Maine, camped beside the Musketaquid or Concord River in Concord. Thoreau records in his journal visiting them after the first snowfall. His notes concern clothing, spears, a sled, canoes, cradle boards, birch bark vessels for holding water and for cooking with hot stones, cooking spits, a handheld ritual device for dispersing clouds, snowshoes, and hunting traps. He carefully includes his own transcriptions of the visitors' words for most of these items. To record the words, he had to listen deliberately and carefully. This indicates his conviction that the human sound associated with an item is as important as its visual appearance. He makes no distinction between the items that any European settler might deem practical and a thing with a ritual use, such as the artuese, made of a stick, leaves, and cord, simply including it in the sequence. Of this item, he notes, make great use of it, count with it, make the clouds go off the sun with it. He doesn't comment on whether it works or not. Thoreau also remarks on a birch bark horn demonstrated by his hosts at the camp. They used this to imitate the bellowing of a moose. He witnessed a horn lure in use 3 years later when he journeyed to the Maine backcountry with his cousin's husband, George Thatcher, for the second time. They traveled by canoe with a Penawepskoi guide, Joseph Etienne. Etienne used his birch bark horn at night to lure moose. Thoreau describes how, dozing, he, quote, would be aroused and brought back to a sense of my actual position by the sound of Joe's birch horn in the midst of all this silence, calling the moose, ugh, ugh, ooh, 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 ooh. Hearing a great horned owl, Thoreau, quote, told Joe that he, the owl, would call out the moose for him, for he made a sound considerably like the horn. But Joe answered that the moose had heard that sound 1,000 times and knew better. Thoreau was learning to distinguish nighttime forest sounds from his Penobscot companion. He acknowledged that he had much to learn, describing an occurrence during a perfectly calm night. And I quote, this is a fairly long quotation. Once, when Joe had called again, and we were listening for moose, we heard come faintly echoing or creeping from far through the moss-clad aisles a dull, dry, rushing sound with a solid core to it, yet as if half smothered under the grasp of the luxuriant and fungus-like forest, like the shutting of a door in some distant entry of the damp and shaggy wilderness. If we had not been there, no mortal had heard it. When we asked Joe in a whisper what it was, he answered, tree fall. Thoreau was learning not only about what a sound might signify, but about a native economy of speech, exemplified by Etienne's two-word explanation. Thoreau's encounter later during this trip with 3 more Native Americans was a key ear-opening experience for him. It led him to a new understanding of the indigenous people who have inhabited what settlers call New England since the deep past. He moved toward an equivalent in sound of what in stone artifacts he called mindprints. When the group set up camp for the night at the head of Moosehead Lake, he shared a tent at their invitation with Joseph Etienne and 3 other native men. That night, he heard a conversation in a native tongue for the first time. And I quote, while lying there listening to the Indians, I amused myself with trying to guess at their subject by their gestures or some proper name introduced. There can be no more startling evidence of there being a distinct and comparatively aboriginal race than to hear this unaltered Indian language, which the white man cannot speak nor understand. These Abenakis gossiped, laughed, and jested in the language which has been spoken in New England, who shall say how long? These were the sounds that issued from the wigwams of this country before Columbus was born. They have not yet died away. Although Thoreau noted their names, it's thanks to the fur trader Manly Hardy, a friend of George Thatcher, that the identities of 2 of Joseph Etienne's 3 fellow Indigenous friends are known, Soissin Tarmont from Quebec and Sebatis Dana. Although from different communities, they spoke mutually intelligible Alnabak, or Abenaki, languages. Thoreau was likely aware of speculations by some transcendentalists, notably Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, that indigenous languages might be close to the very origins of language. Etienne's, Dana's, and Tarmont's voices, gossiping, laughing, jesting, were for Thoreau sounds that had, as he put it, come down to us from so far, as the sonic equivalents of the stone artifacts that he regarded as mindprints. In his earlier thinking about sounds that had come down to us from so far, Thoreau had in mind not native peoples, but Homer, certain strains of music, and the Hindu Vedas. In the passage in A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, beginning, "What are ears? What is time?" he associates music and the Greek and Indian writings he mentions with, quote, the idea of infinite remoteness as well as of beauty and serenity, for to the senses that is the farthest from us, which addresses the greatest depth within us. His experience in the backwoods of Maine in 1853 led him to reconceive the notion he'd formed in response to ancient Greece and India as a transcendence he could thenceforth associate yet more vividly with the native inhabitants of North America. And this was to be a theme prompted by sound that he would pursue for the rest of his life. However fugitive laughter and gossip may be, Thoreau suggests that their recollection can evoke a sense of sound traversing time through the imagination. On this account, this lends temporal depth to a place, even if it has been abandoned by its one-time inhabitants. He suggests as much when discussing those former enslaved Concordians of African descent who were his ghostly neighbours at Walden Pond. He writes in Walden, "Within the memory of many of my townsmen, the road near which my house stands resounded with the laugh and gossip of inhabitants, and the woods which border it were notched and dotted here and there with their little gardens and dwellings. These are the sounds of human communication, and Thoreau has much to say about it. He relished what he called gossip. He meant what a later generation would term the news, noting in Walden, quote, "Every day or two I strolled to the village to hear some of the gossip which is incessantly going on there, circulating either from mouth to mouth or from newspaper to newspaper, and which, taken in homeopathic doses, was really as refreshing in its way as the rustle of leaves and the peeping of frogs." He acknowledges, though, that communication through speech is uncertain, writing in Walden, "The bullet of your thought must have overcome its lateral and ricochet motion and fallen into its last and steady course before it reaches the ear of the hearer, else it may plough out again through the side of his head." Thoreau constantly notes distant human-made sounds, such as church bells, railroad locomotives, song heard from afar, and musicians playing instruments in the evening. Most of all, Thoreau notes sounds in nature ranging from the rustle of leaves to bird and animal calls and the cracking of the earth in extreme winter cold. Various thinkers have discussed the distinctions and continuities that Thoreau makes between music and other sounds. The composer John Cage, an admirer of Thoreau, was among the first to point to Thoreau's unwillingness to separate sound from music. Cage's 1975 composition Lecture on the Weather for 12 speaker vocalists or instrumentalists subjected, in Cage's words, Thoreau's writings to I Ching chance operations to obtain collage texts. Cage noted that for Thoreau, sound and music form a continuum, writing, "Music, he, that is Thoreau, said, is continuous. Only listening is intermittent." Others have picked up on Cage's insight. Musicologist Jeff Todd Tighton points out that Thoreau, quote, "regarded human music as a manifestation of the more inclusive and significant category, sound." Thoreau gives an early indication of his evaluative taxonomy in a journal entry in August 1838, in which he writes, "Some sounds seem to reverberate along the plain and then settle to earth again like dust. Such are noise, discord, jargon. But such only as spring heavenward, and I may catch from steeples and hilltops in their upward course, which are the more refined parts of the former, are the true sphere music, pure, unmixed music, in which no wail mingles." Although Thoreau expresses a preference for what he deems to be music in natural or inadvertent sounds, he regularly writes of his enjoyment of human-made music, and he made music himself. Although he enjoyed a good tune, he holds that, quote, "the music is not in the tune, it is in the sound." Yet this thought did not prevent Thoreau from performing music expressively himself. He often sang Charles Dibdin's elegiac sea song, Tom Bowling. Edward Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson's son, wrote, "No one who has heard Tom Bowling from Thoreau could ask if he were capable of human feeling." Thoreau's favoured sounds as music were products of both the natural and the human-made worlds, and his understanding of them was aesthetic. Many of the natural sounds of which Thoreau writes, again and again, are those of birds, toads, frogs, and insects. Wherever he went, sounds constituted his world of that moment. These include sounds that others might hear, crickets, sparrows, or sounds that would escape all but the most attentive, such as he records hearing on Fairhaven Hill in July 1852. "I hear the scratching sound of a worm at work in this hard wood pile on which I sit." After 9 years of work and 7 drafts, Thoreau distilled his pre-1854 thoughts on sound worlds in Walden. There he describes the situation of his house near the pond and reflects on time, stating, "My days were not days of the week, bearing the stamp of any heathen deity, nor were they minced into hours and fretted by the ticking of a clock." He contrasts this world in which sounds reflect a free-form time with the effect of the railroad, only a third of a mile distant, on which the cars travel noisily, altering the world through which they pass by their novel movement of people and commodities. Above all, Thoreau notes that the railroad has changed the inhabitant's sense of time through its sounds. In Walden, he writes, "They go and come with such regularity and precision, and their whistle can be heard so far, that the farmers set their clocks by them, and thus one well-conducted institution regulates a whole country." He pointedly contrasts locomotives, an iron horse with his snort like thunder, with the sounds of the birds he could hear from his pondside house, beginning with the nocturnal whippoorwills. These birds, he writes, chanted their vespers for half an hour, sitting on a stump by my door or upon the ridgepole of the house. They would begin to sing almost with as much precision as a clock, within 5 minutes of a particular time, referred to the setting of the sun every evening. In other words, the sound world of the whippoorwill was as reliable to one who listens for it as was the whistle of the locomotive. Yet, even though they intersect, these worlds differ from one another profoundly. One sound that came to obsess Thoreau was that of wind in telegraph wires. In A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, he recounts hearing, quote, "a faint music in the air like an aeolian harp, which I immediately suspected to proceed from the cord of the telegraph, vibrating in the just awakening morning wind." He was familiar with the aeolian harp, for he had one himself. He contrasts what he describes as the higher and lower uses of the telegraph, claiming that through, quote, "that vibrating cord high in the air over the shores of earth, I heard a fairer news than the journals ever print. It told of things worthy to hear and worthy of the electric fluid to carry the news of, not of the price of cotton and flour, but it hinted at the price of the world itself and of things which are priceless, of absolute truth and beauty." Once the telegraph wires had been installed along the track of the Fitchburg Railroad, which he habitually followed between Walden Pond and the village, Thoreau went to hear what he called the telegraph harp repeatedly. For him, it was a particularly clear instance of how, as he put it, quote, "the fibers of all things have their tension and are strained like the strings of a lyre." Moreover, the music he heard in the sound prompted him to suggest that its effect was, quote, "as if every fiber was affected and being seasoned or timed, rearranged according to a new and more harmonious law." In Thoreau's conception, those fibers of all things extended well beyond the telegraph harp. Writing about the roots of white pine trees in a journal entry in November 1850, he notes, "The different branches of the roots continually grow into one another, so as to make grotesque figures, sometimes rude harps, whose resonant strings of roots give a sort of musical sound when struck, such as the earth spirit might play on." The following summer, he extended his notion of what a harp might be from individual items to the entire phenomenal world, writing in his journal, "To ears that are expanded, what a harp this world is! The occupied ear thinks that beyond the cricket no sound can be heard, but there is an immortal melody that may be heard morning, noon, and night by ears that can attend, and from time to time this man or that hears it, having ears that were made for music." Being attuned to the harp of the world is, for Thoreau, not only a matter of cultivating aesthetic attentiveness, but a question of being aurally attuned to what others ignore. With this in mind, less than 3 weeks later, he could write of an experience one evening at the old house he admired on the west bank of the Musketaquid or Sudbury River. Quote, Sitting on the doorstep of the Conant house at 9 o'clock, I hear a pear drop. How few of all the apples that fall do we hear fall? He heard it with ears that are expanded, as he had so recently put it. As is so often the case, this perception of a pear dropping and the reflection it prompted may have been aesthetically couched, but Thoreau's response was not exclusively aesthetic. Rather, it was ethical and metaphysical, pertaining to the laws of the universe. He makes this explicit in the Higher Laws chapter of Walden. Quote, "Though the youth at last grows indifferent, the laws of the universe are not indifferent, but are forever on the side of the most sensitive. Listen to every zephyr for some reproof, for it is surely there, and he is unfortunate who does not hear it. We cannot touch a string or move a stop, but the charming moral transfixes us." To hear music in sounds is to break, in his words, petty and narrow bonds. These are the bonds that bind humans as they age, maturing and declining from the child who, as he puts it in an 1852 journal entry, loves to strike on a tin pan or other ringing vessel with a stick, to whom there is music in sound alone. In a journal entry in 1851, Thoreau recalls, "In youth, before I lost any of my senses, I can remember that I was all alive and inhabited my body with inexpressible satisfaction. Both its weariness and its refreshment were sweet to me. This earth was the most glorious musical instrument, and I was audience to its strains. To have such sweet impressions made on us, such ecstasies begotten of the breezes, I can remember how I was astonished." Thoreau expresses a determination to recover a lost childlike sensitivity to sounds. But how is one to achieve this state of recovered sensibility? How can one expand one's ears? Describing sounds heard during a nighttime walk to Walden Pond in June 1851 in a journal entry, Thoreau complains, questions, and counsels. "We live but a quarter part of our life. Why do we not let on the flood, raise the gates, and set all our wheels in motion? He that hath ears to hear, let him hear. Employ your senses." Later that summer, he suggests that the physical exertion of a long walk in the summer heat can create the conditions for attaining a heightened sensibility. He writes of his state after such a walk, "Every sound is music now. The grating of some distant boat which a man is launching on the rocky bottom, though here is no man nor inhabited house, nor even cultivated field in sight. This is heard with such distinctness that I listen with pleasure as if it was music." A year later, the sound of a distant piano heard from his garret window at noon rekindled his oral sensibility. In response, he writes, "By some fortunate coincidence of thought or circumstance, I am attuned to the universe. I am fitted to hear. My being moves in a sphere of melody. My fancy and imagination are excited to an inconceivable degree. There is no longer the dull earth on which I stood." But, we might ask, through such recovery, what exactly does one attain? The ideal attainment is a healthy soul. 10 years previously, in an April 1841 journal entry, Thoreau had drawn attention to what he terms the healthy ear, writing, "Music is the sound of the circulation in nature's veins. It is the flux which melts nature. Men dance to it, glasses ring and vibrate, and the fields seem to undulate. The healthy ear always hears it, nearer or more remote." 10 years later, he is direct in stating that the goal for which one must aim is a soul in health. In Walden, he quotes the disciple of Confucius, known to him as Zheng Qiu, now known as Zheng Zhen or Zheng Ji. He wrote of a human being's failure to perceive adequately through the senses. Quote, "The soul not being mistress of herself," says Zheng Qiu, "one looks and one does not see. One listens and one does not hear. One eats and one does not know the savour of food. In his discussion of a soul in health in an 1852 journal entry, Thoreau claims that when the soul is mistress of herself, courage can put upon the face of things a quality that he terms a perpetual flow of spirit. According to Thoreau, these are the conditions that allow one, through aesthetic and ethical appreciation, to penetrate beyond metaphor and symbol to the actuality of phenomena, thereby perceiving sphere music and the divine. He declares this belief in the Friday section of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. Quote, "We need pray for no higher heaven than the pure senses can furnish, a purely sensuous life. Our present senses are but the rudiments of what they are destined to become. We are comparatively deaf, dumb, and blind, and without smell or taste or feeling. Every generation makes the discovery that its divine vigour has been dissipated, and each sense and faculty misapplied and debauched. The ears were made not for such trivial uses as men are wont to suppose, but to hear celestial sounds." For Thoreau, sphere music is not metaphorical, but an actuality present in the tiniest orally perceptible phenomena, so long as one has recovered the necessary sensibility. As he puts it in a journal entry at the end of 1852, "Unless the humming of a gnat is the music of the spheres, and the music of the spheres is as the humming of a gnat, they are naught to me." Insofar as Thoreau's recognition of the value of such phenomena is aesthetic, the humming of a gnat, the squeaking of the snow under our boots, and any number of other natural and human-made sounds that constitute Thoreau's sonic worlds engage the aesthetics of the environment and everyday aesthetics. In Thoreau's opinion, when the soul is in health and mistress of herself, the ear being healthy, sound can affect the human body profoundly. In a journal entry in July 1851, he writes, "The creaking of the crickets seems at the very foundation of all sound. At last I cannot tell it from the ringing in my ears. It is a sound from within, not without. You cannot dispose of it by listening to it. When I am stilled, I hear it. It reminds me that I am a denizen of the earth." This intermingling of sounds as though from within the body and those from without led Thoreau to conceive of the human body properly attuned as itself a musical instrument. This thought came to him in a dream that he recounts in a journal entry in October 1851. He dreamed that he was first sailing, then walking with his friend Bronson Alcott. I quote, "And then again, the instant that I awoke, methought I was a musical instrument, from which I heard a strain die out, a bugle, a clarionet, or a flute. My body was the organ and channel of melody, as a flute is of the music that is breathed through it. My flesh sounded and vibrated still to the strain, and my nerves were the chords of the lyre. I awoke, therefore, to an infinite regret, to find myself not the thoroughfare of glorious and world-stirring inspirations, but a scuttle full of dirt." Pursuing the need to keep the soul and body in health if sounds are to provide what he called glorious and world-stirring inspirations, Thoreau reports in a September 1853 journal entry, "It occurred to me when I awoke this morning that man was to be treated as a musical instrument, and if any viol was to be made of sound timber and kept well tuned always, it was he, so that when the bow of events is drawn across him, he may vibrate and resound in perfect harmony. A sensitive soul will be continually trying its strings to see if they are in tune. A man's body must be rasped down exactly to a shaving. It is of far more importance than the wood of a Cremona violin." If the human body, properly attuned, can function as a musical instrument, sensitive to an intermingling of sounds from within and without, it is as though the faculty, often described as the inner ear, begins to hear sounds not perceptible to those with what Thoreau regards as corrupted senses. The inner ear is what hears what Thoreau, in the conclusion to Walden, famously terms a different drummer. If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. The sounds that constitute sonic realms are invariably simple, whether natural or human-made. They include the wind in the trees, the cracking of the ground by frost, the cries of birds, the hum of insects, the woodcutter's axe, distant church bells and musical instruments, drums, clarinets, flutes. These are all subject to the aesthetics of the environment and of the everyday. Music performed for an audience, a standard subject for aesthetic regard, is of but little account to Thoreau. Quote, "One will lose no music by not attending the oratorios and operas," he claims in an August 1851 journal entry. He continues, "The really inspiring melodies are cheap and universal and are as audible to the poor man's son as to the rich man's. These humble sounds, when audible to a sensitive, healthy soul that is mistress of herself, directly afford transcendence. These humble sounds also serve as mindprints, analogues of the artifacts that Thoreau associated principally with the native peoples of what had become New England. He makes this clear in a journal entry in 1851, inspired by the song of a robin at Punkatasset Pond, 2 miles north of Concord Village. He describes the robin's song as capable of compressing time from when it was heard exclusively by native inhabitants to the present. He condenses this thought in the spring chapter of Walden. Quote, "I heard a robin in the distance, the first I had heard for many 1,000 years, methought, whose note I shall not forget for many 1,000 more, the same sweet and powerful song as of yore." This thought, to bring the mind prints that are arrowheads into propinquity with the song of a robin, depends on the role that native peoples played in Thoreau's developing philosophy. During his second visit to the Maine backwoods in 1853, his overhearing Joseph Aitken, Swasin, Tarmont, and Sabattis Dana speaking in their own tongues seemed to collapse time and further attune an already sensitized mind to the myriad everyday sounds around him. The effect of his third visit to Maine in 1857 with Edward Hoare was more profound yet. Their guide, Joseph Polis, a Penobscot leader, confounded everything Thoreau knew. Polis was a remarkable man. He had represented his nation in Augusta, the capital of Maine, and in Washington, D.C. A Protestant Christian, he was also a shaman, a fact not known to Thoreau. Thoreau's recent biographer, Laura Dassau-Walls, recounts how during their time in the Maine backwoods, Polis, clumsily pressed by Thoreau, selectively introduced the philosopher to aspects of native knowledge. When Thoreau returned to Concord, his enthusiasm for the breadth and profundity of that knowledge surprised his friends. Thereafter, Thoreau continued to add to his pages of notes on Native American peoples in what, by the time of his death in 1862, would be 12 manuscript volumes. One of the characteristic musical instruments of the Algonquian peoples of northern New England is the flute. Carved from hardwood, it functions on the whistle principle. The flute has a special place in Thoreau's worlds of sound. The flute, of the transverse kind, was the instrument that Thoreau himself played. His own flute is in the Concord Museum. Playing his flute was clearly a meditative activity for Thoreau based on improvisation, which he called unpremeditated music. He regarded this as, in his words, the true gauge which measures the current of our thoughts, the very undertow of our life's stream. The sound of the flute plays a vital role in the development of Thoreau's philosophy. At the end of the Higher Laws chapter of Walden, Thoreau casts himself as John Farmer, preoccupied with his labours even after bathing and seating himself at his door. Of Farmer, Thoreau writes, He had not attended to the train of his thoughts long when he heard someone playing on a flute, and that sound harmonized with his mood. Still he thought of his work, but the notes of the flute came home to his ears out of a different sphere from that he worked in, and suggested work for certain faculties which slumbered in him. The sound of a distant flute prompted the adoption of a way of life that might eventually lead to his soul becoming sensitive, healthy, and mistress of herself, thereby being directly afforded transcendence. Thoreau was an avid reader of Hindu holy books. He conceived Walden in the form of sacred scripture on the pattern of the Bhagavad Gita. Thoreau knew, as the Bhagavata Purana recounts, that Krishna, eighth avatar of Vishnu, played the flute. A transverse flute is one of the Lord Krishna's most prominent attributes. Thoreau's English friend, Thomas Cholmondeley, sent as a gift to Thoreau in November 1855 44 volumes of Hindu scriptures in English or French translations. Thoreau had already read borrowed copies of many of these works, including the Bhagavata Purana. Walden, published the previous year, contains many references to Hindu scriptures. Because of the Lord Krishna's example, the sound of the flute among human-made instruments has a sacred dimension that cannot have escaped Thoreau. Allusions to Hindu holy books and their many gods, avatars, and other sacred characters would have confounded most of Thoreau's American contemporaries, though not Emerson. In contrast, for many of them, the Greek god Pan, the unruly lord of untamed forests whose attribute was his pipes, was an easily graspable alter ego for Thoreau. Louisa May Alcott, Bronson and Abigail May Alcott's second daughter, had grown up with Thoreau as a family friend. She would publish one of this country's finest novels, Little Women, in 1868. In September 1863, she published an elegiac poem in memory of Thoreau in The Atlantic. Titled Thoreau's Flute, it begins, "We sighing said, our Pan is dead. His pipe hangs mute beside the river." But she continues, "Then from the flute, untouched by hands, there came a low harmonious breath. For such as he there is no death, his life the eternal life commands." To his flute's breath, Alcott ascribes the words of the concluding stanza. To him no vain regrets belong, whose soul, that finer instrument, gave to the world no poor lament, but wood notes ever sweet and strong. O lonely friend, he still will be a potent presence, though unseen, steadfast, sagacious, and serene. Seek not for him, he is with thee. If, as I contend, aesthetics plays a vital role in Thoreau's thinking and practical philosophy, what he could hear was as important to him as what he could see and touch. And the romantic in each of us might accept Louisa May Alcott's intuition that Thoreau's flute, instrument of his unpremeditated music, may yet be sensed by the attentive inner ear through the woods and across the waters of Walden, sounding, to paraphrase Keats, unheard melodies sweeter than those heard. Thoreau's aesthetics of sound, as well as of material items both natural and human-made, comprised judgments in broader terms than beauty and sublimity. His aesthetics embraces perception by feeling involving the emotions. For Thoreau, aesthetics was a matter of sensibility. This sensibility allowed him to be aesthetically responsive to a wider range of phenomena than the fine arts. In particular, he initiated an environmental aesthetics and an everyday aesthetics. Thoreau's contemporary George Eliot captures this sensitivity to what she calls ordinary human life focused on sound. In the first volume of her novel Middlemarch, she writes, "If we had a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heart beat, and we should die of that roar which lies on the other side of silence." she continues, as it is, the quickest of us walk about well wadded with stupidity. Thoreau surely is among the quickest of us. He is one who hears the grass grow, the squirrel's heartbeat, and, as he himself wrote, the worm at work in this hardwood pile on which I sit. Thank you. Thanks for that very warm reception. I'm very happy to take some questions. Aaron will chair so that I'm relieved of that hideous responsibility.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivan, for this fantastic talk. I had the pleasure to read Walden with you last fall. Fantastic, life-changing book, class, etc. What lessons might your work with Thoreau and your attention to the ephemeral world help us to... Okay, I'm gonna retrace my steps. How might attention to the ephemeral and the vital help us to transform our work as historians of the material world?
Mhm. I think that Thoreau's sensitivity to the material artifacts, as well as things in nature, and it's very difficult to make that division. It's one that he grew up with and assumed, but he's constantly transgressing it. So, but I'm going to stick with that. I think the mind print is important for him as a way of understanding that life is long in terms of not the individual, but of humans, of mortals. And there's an amazing passage in his journal where he writes about an arrowhead. And he writes in the person of the arrowhead as though the arrowhead is speaking. The arrowhead says, I have to paraphrase, you may think you have me. You picked me up. You put me on a shelf. But your grandson will forget me. I will fall through the crumbling floorboards of your house into the cellar. And then at a later date, some other person will pick me up and fasten me to a shaft and use me. And as that sense of time that it's not an historical understanding of time, it's an intuitive understanding of time that has at its root both, it seems to me, an aesthetic and a moral basis. But I think he sees this, and I think this is something that I would follow with him in, that this is a responsibility of ours to encompass in our imaginations the fact that time and the passage of time, the experience of human beings imbricated in the worlds that humans live a part of and are but a part of, that this is something that we had better be attuned to.
Thank you. That was wonderful, Ivan. solace today, I feel. And on that note, the ideal attainment is a healthy soul. How might Thoreau help us in these current days to use the soundscapes and the mind prints? What might be his advice to us today when there is so much more noise?
Yes, yes, noise. Well, he writes, and I quoted that passage in an early journal entry, distinguishing noise, jargon, discord that falls to the earth, to the dust, from what becomes sphere music. And I think we might want to try to follow Thoreau in making that distinction and attending to the sounds that can help us to develop, I'm going to use his term here, a healthy soul, rather than be consumed by the noise, jargon, and discord. That's what I would suggest.
Before the mic goes to the back of the room, I'm going to take the chair's privilege to ask a question. It has to do with the time, what you were talking about, the temporality question. And you'll be shocked to hear I'm going to ask you a question about his relationship with Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
I'm particularly interested in the comparison that he made, the propinquity, as you put it, between the objects and the sounds.
Yeah.
And in particular, the sounds of indigenous languages.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding full well that he was a product of his mid-19th century milieu, in his writings and in your engagement with them, does he engage with what the anthropologist Johannes Bobian 40 years ago called the denial of coevalness, the assumption that indigenous people authentically belong to a time that's different from Europeans, and the assumption that indigenous languages were remnants like arrowheads,
Yeah.
that they are somehow intrinsically audibly of the past in the present,
Yeah.
as opposed to in the present,
Yeah.
like European languages, which also existed in the past and changed over time. And especially given the fact that he had friendly relationships with indigenous people, that he traveled with them, that he camped with them, that, they existed with him in time and space. And can you talk a little bit about that sort of attribution of those languages or certain languages to allowing this kind of temporal bridging, maybe in a different way than others? Or is that an assumption that I'm projecting onto this?
I don't think it's no, I don't think so. It's complicated. Thoreau's thoughts about, as we know them from his writings, and his actions as well, as recorded, Thoreau's thoughts about native peoples changed in the course of his life. He grows up at a time when, in the 1830s, he's at college. He grows up at a time when the value, civilized values, means Mediterranean values, Greece and Rome. This is how he's educated at Harvard. It takes a while for him to expand upon that. He also has many of the assumptions that his contemporaries had about the disappearance of native peoples. He writes about when he's working in his bean field, when he's living at Walden, that first hoeing season in the fall of 1845, of finding arrowheads there. But as a reminder that an ancient people lived here before him, but it is as though they've been trodden into the face of the earth. So, but this changes as he has increasing contact with and discussions with native people. he goes with his friend Daniel Ricketts, who lived near New Bedford, to visit ostensibly the last wholly native inhabitant of that area of southern Massachusetts. And he writes a very interesting and sympathetic account of her living in a hut no bigger than my own, but acknowledges that she has lost her language. And she tells him this. She's an elderly woman. She said, "My father was the last who could speak my language, and I couldn't understand him, except when he was praying the words Jesus Christ." And so, language loss. I think he's also extremely impressed by the articulacy and the ability of native people to speak purposefully on occasions. He's very impressed when he hears the Dakota leader, known in English as Little Crow, speak at the annual distribution of treaty goods in 1861 in what's now Minnesota. He was traveling in an attempt to alleviate his tuberculosis, but he traveled with the governor of Minnesota and a whole party to this gathering where hundreds of Dakota arrive to receive treaty goods, and there's speeches. And he said, Thoreau reports in a letter how, although he couldn't understand, he could tell that Little Crow and his fellows could speak so much better than the governor and his party. So, and as far as this, the sense of loss goes, I think that the impression that Joseph Polis made on Thoreau was really profound. And Emerson, who probably knew him better than anyone other than his immediate family, Emerson, in his remarks at Thoreau's funeral, says there are three people who really mattered to Thoreau, and one of them was Joseph Polis. So it's complicated. Yeah. Can I also just say, because I think this is really important, that there's a resurgence and a revival of what I would term hitherto dormant native languages in New England, and the Wampanoag language project that's run by the Wampanoag, the Akina Wampanoag tribe, is an exemplary instance of this language revival. Claude.
Genealogy. Was Thoreau French or French Canadian, and did he ever marry and have children?
He was not French Canadian. His grandfather, Jean Thoreau, came to the Old World here. I think of America as the Old World, not the New World. Thinking native. He came here from Jersey, the Channel Island of Jersey. His family was Huguenot and had moved to Jersey in the 18th century, or maybe in the late 17th century after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which I'm sure you'll all remember was 1680. So he was of Jersey French stock. And did he ever marry? No, he didn't. But he did court a young woman in his youth. He and his brother John both courted must have been a fascinating young woman named Ellen Sewell. And John proposed to her. Her father said, no, you mustn't marry him. Then Thoreau proposed to her by letter, and her father said, no, you can't have anything to do with these people. They're friends of Emerson, and he's a troublemaker. So
no children.
no children. He was very close to his sisters. Helen, who also died before him, like John, and Sophia, who, as I mentioned, was basically his literary executor.
Any other questions? If not, join me in thanking my